Daniel Price had always believed that some land carried memory, that soil could hold laughter, grief, and the echoes of every hand that ever worked it. His 2-acre plot at the edge of Alder Creek Estates wasn't much to look at by city standards. No white fences, no uniform lawns. But it was the last piece of his father's property that hadn't been eaten by the HOA's steady march of expansion. When his dad, Ray Price, bought the land back in 1979, it was nothing but a gravel driveway and a tangle of pines, a forgotten wedge between county forest and farmland. The HOA didn't even exist back then. The bylaws and architectural committees came decades later when investors bought the old mill lots and turned the valley into a planned community. Daniel had no issue with the transformation, not at first. People wanted nice lawns and dog parks, fine. What bothered him was the arrogance that crept in with the paperwork. Each year, the HOA pushed a little further, claiming ditches, trails, even drainage easements as shared spaces. His land sat at the border, a legal gray zone they didn't fully control but acted like they did. The trouble started on a cold February morning when he saw surveyors at the edge of his fence line, orange vests gleaming in the mist. They said they were checking elevations for the community park extension. He didn't think much of it then. But by April, bulldozers had arrived. Daniel came home from his welding shift to find a backhoe chewing into the far corner of his field, turning wild grass and clover into raw mud. When he confronted the site manager, a young man with mirrored sunglasses and a clipboard, he got the usual deflection. "We're working under HOA direction. It's part of the playground expansion. You'll be getting a notice soon." A notice? On his own property? He tried calling the HOA office, but their property compliance coordinator said the parcel was community-adjacent land held under joint maintenance. Joint maintenance, a phrase that made his blood boil. His father's deed sat framed above his workbench, stamped and notarized from 1979, describing the boundary in black ink. From the Sycamore Ridge north to the Alder Creek, thence west 240 feet. That creek, that ridge, that field, all of it was his. But the HOA, led by its new president, a woman named Judith Kellerman, wasn't one to back down. Judith had a smile sharp enough to cut paper and a habit of quoting bylaws like they were gospel. "We have legal authority over all undeveloped tracts within visual scope of the recreation area," she said at the next board meeting, voice sweet but cold. Daniel recorded the whole thing on his phone. He'd been raised polite, but he wasn't stupid. What followed was a summer-long siege disguised as progress. Trucks rolled in day after day, laying down mulch, pouring concrete curbs, installing bright red slides and picnic tables, all on the very edge of Daniel's pasture. They tore down the old wire fence his father had built and replaced it with decorative landscaping that bled 2 meters into his property. He watched it happen in silence, documenting everything: photos, GPS coordinates, invoices. His neighbors thought he'd given permission. "You must be proud," one said. They finally did something with that empty lot. Daniel just nodded, biting back what he really wanted to say. He called the county assessor's office to confirm his parcel boundaries. The clerk, a man named Ernest, spent an hour cross-checking maps. "Mr. Price," he said finally, "your deed's valid and recorded. That land is yours outright. There's no joint maintenance, no easement. The HOA's expansion permit stops 30 feet short of your line." That's when Daniel realized it wasn't ignorance. It was theft. He tried reasoning first. He sent formal letters, then certified mail, outlining the encroachment and requesting a stop work order. No response. The HOA's next newsletter even bragged about the new community playground generously supported by local cooperation. They'd built a gazebo right where his father used to plant beans. He attended another board meeting and stood quietly until the public comment period opened. When his turn came, he placed copies of the deed on the table. "You're building on private property," he said evenly. "Mine." Judith leaned forward, clasping her hands. "That's an old record, Mr. Price. Boundaries have shifted under community zoning. You'll need to file a variance if you want to contest." It was the smirk that broke him. Not the words, but the look that said she'd already won. He walked out before he said something that would get him fined for disruptive conduct. Over the next few weeks, the playground rose like a taunt. Swing sets gleaming, benches installed, fresh sod unrolled. Kids from the neighborhood began to play there every evening, their laughter echoing across the field. Daniel couldn't even bring himself to hate that part. It wasn't the children's fault. They didn't know their sandbox sat on stolen dirt. But every night when the streetlights flicked on and the HOA cameras blinked red at the corners, Daniel would stand at the property line and think about his father's voice. If someone wants your land bad enough, son, they're either hiding something under it or above it. That sentence started looping in his mind. He began digging, not literally, but through records, county archives, zoning maps, survey plats. He spent weekends in the musty basement of City Hall, flipping through old tax ledgers. That's where he found the smoking gun. A minor adjustment recorded 2 years earlier by the HOA's previous president. A community boundary correction that extended their jurisdiction line precisely onto his parcel. The kicker? It was never notarized or approved by the county planning board. A forged plat map, slipped quietly into the record and rubber-stamped by a junior clerk who retired months later. He took photos of every page, highlighting signatures that didn't match. He'd learned enough from watching courtroom documentaries to know what that meant. Intent to defraud. Still, Daniel didn't act immediately. He knew how people like Judith worked. They thrived on confrontation, on painting homeowners as unstable troublemakers. So he smiled, nodded, and let them finish. He watched the ribbon-cutting ceremony from a distance, standing beside his truck. Balloons floated. Parents clapped. Judith gave a speech about community unity. The local newspaper took photos. Daniel even waved. Because he wasn't planning to fight them in the dirt. He was going to bury them in paperwork. That night, in his dim kitchen lit only by the glow of his laptop, he built what he jokingly called the Freedom Folder. Inside, the original deed, certified surveys, the fraudulent map copy, and timestamps of every photo he'd taken during construction. He also recorded his calls with the county assessor and backed everything to 2 flash drives, one hidden under his truck seat. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was precise. When Judith's office sent him a late fee notice for unkept property perimeter obstructing playground maintenance, he laughed out loud. It was the final piece of proof that the HOA believed their lie enough to enforce it. By September, the playground was complete, and Daniel had what he needed. The land was worth maybe $60,000 on paper, but the principal was priceless. He reached out to a quiet, steel-eyed property lawyer named Martha Vale, a woman known in the county for dismantling shady developers. She reviewed his evidence and gave him a look equal parts admiration and disbelief. "You've done half my job for me," she said. "You realize what this means, right? They built permanent structures on private land. You can file for full removal, damages, even trespass penalties." Daniel nodded slowly. "Not yet," he said. "Let them open it first." Martha raised an eyebrow. "You're patient for a man whose land got stolen." He smiled faintly. "No, I'm just letting them hang their own sign first." And so he waited. The first weekend of October, the HOA hosted its grand opening. Kids swarmed the slides, families brought picnics. Judith cut another ribbon and gave another speech about community harmony. Daniel stood across the road, hands in his pockets, silent witness to the irony, because tucked inside his truck was a sealed manila envelope addressed to the county court clerk, containing a lawsuit that would soon change everything. As the sound of children's laughter echoed down the valley, Daniel whispered under his breath, "Enjoy it while you can." The wind carried the words across the field, past the plastic slides, over the stolen soil. He didn't know it yet, but his quiet patience was about to ignite one of the most talked-about HOA battles the county had ever seen. The following Monday, Daniel walked into the county courthouse with the calm of a man who already knew he'd won, even if nobody else did. His boots left faint scuffs on the polished tile floor as he approached the civil filings window, that same manila envelope tucked under his arm. Inside was a meticulously prepared complaint. Unlawful encroachment, property damage, fraudulent record alteration, and trespass with intent. Martha, his attorney, had made sure every word was airtight. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with silver glasses, skimmed the first page and looked up at him with a faint smirk. "You're going after Alder Creek Estates HOA?" she said. Daniel nodded. "Then I hope you brought patience. They've got deep pockets." He just replied, "Ma'am, I've got something deeper. The truth." Within 48 hours, the summons was served. Judith received it during her afternoon board meeting, in front of the entire committee. Several homeowners later swore they saw her face turn crimson before she dismissed the process server with a hissed, "Get out!" The HOA's PR machine kicked into motion immediately. Emails about misunderstandings, neighborhood gossip about Daniel being a bitter loner, rumors that he was trying to shake down the community for money. Daniel stayed quiet. He'd already learned the golden rule of fighting bullies: never shout while they're busy digging their own hole. Within 2 weeks, the case made local headlines. Resident sues HOA over playground land dispute. The story didn't sound explosive yet, just another property quarrel. But what the article didn't say was how much evidence Daniel had compiled. Martha began the discovery process with surgical precision, filing motions to compel the HOA to produce all records related to the playground's approval. That's when things started to unravel. The HOA submitted incomplete paperwork, missing signatures, mismatched survey coordinates, and a building permit that referenced a lot number that didn't exist. The county inspector, when subpoenaed, admitted he'd approved the playground on assumption that the HOA's survey was accurate. Translation: they'd lied, and nobody had checked. Judith tried to bluff her way through, calling the whole thing a clerical mistake. But every time she denied, Daniel produced another time-stamped photograph, another voice recording, another notarized affidavit from neighbors who remembered seeing his fence torn down. One night, Martha called him laughing. "They just filed a motion claiming your father's deed is invalid because it's too old to apply. I can't decide if that's arrogance or desperation." Daniel leaned back in his chair and said, "Maybe both." Meanwhile, the community began to split. Some homeowners sided with Daniel, uneasy about how fast the board had expanded its control. Others, the loyalists, accused him of greed. HOA social media pages filled with heated arguments. Parents asked whether the playground would be shut down, while Judith posted carefully worded updates insisting everything was under review. Behind the scenes, she convened emergency meetings trying to find a way to buy Daniel out quietly. One night, she even showed up at his doorstep, pearl earrings glinting in the porch light, with a folder of proposals. "Mr. Price," she said in that syrupy voice, "the board is prepared to offer you fair compensation for the disputed portion, above market value, of course. Let's avoid unpleasantness." Daniel stared at her for a long second. "You want to buy what's already mine?" He said, "No thanks. I'll stick with ownership." When he closed the door, Judith's mask cracked. She muttered something about making this ugly for him. Martha anticipated the counterattack. HOAs rarely went down without dragging reputations through the mud. Sure enough, within days, Daniel started receiving violation letters: weeds too tall, mailbox paint chipped, non-compliant vehicle parked overnight. It would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. Each fine he photographed and filed as evidence of retaliation. Martha called it pattern establishment, a term that made Daniel smile grimly. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew patterns better than most. 30 years of welding pipelines taught him how to spot a fracture before it split the steel. And this HOA had fractures running everywhere. By late November, the court ordered both parties into mediation, the last stop before a full trial. They met in a drab conference room at the county building. Daniel sat at one end, calm and stone-faced. Judith and her attorney occupied the other, radiating polished confidence. The mediator, a soft-spoken retired judge, opened with the usual script about compromise. Judith's lawyer offered the same deal as before: cash payout, NDA, mutual release. Daniel didn't even blink. "I'm not selling," he said. "I'm reclaiming." The mediator sighed. "Then we moved to trial." Judith's attorney leaned forward. "Mr. Price, you're playing a dangerous game. If we lose, the community loses its park. You'll be the man who took joy from children." Daniel's answer was measured, quiet. "I didn't take anything. You built joy on stolen ground." The mediator adjourned 5 minutes later, muttering that it was the shortest session he'd ever seen. As the trial date approached, the HOA's facade began to crumble. Contractors who'd worked on the playground were called in for depositions. And one of them, a subcontractor named Leo Martinez, admitted under oath that he'd been told to ignore boundary stakes because they'd be moved later. That single statement shifted the tone of the entire case. It transformed Daniel's claim from a petty property squabble into a story of deliberate misconduct. Reporters started circling again, this time sensing blood. A local news segment aired under the headline, "Homeowner claims HOA built park on his land." Cameras panned over kids playing on bright equipment while the reporter's voice explained the lawsuit. Daniel watched it quietly at home, coffee steaming beside him. It wasn't fame he wanted, it was validation. The HOA board panicked. Emergency emails flew around. Judith's tone changed from smug to strained. Her lawyer suggested a quiet settlement before trial, warning that the public optics were getting ugly. But she refused to back down. Pride or fear of precedent kept her doubling down. She even ordered new signage for the Playground Reading Community Park, property of Alder Creek HOA. It was a bold move and an idiotic one, because Martha filed an injunction within hours, arguing that the act constituted continuing encroachment under pending litigation. The judge granted it. Within 24 hours, deputies arrived and taped yellow "No Access" under legal review signs across the playground gate. Parents complained, kids cried, and cameras rolled. For the first time, the narrative shifted. The villain wasn't Daniel anymore. It was the HOA. Behind the scenes, Martha and Daniel worked like a tactical unit. She drafted motions. He gathered old letters from his father's files proving historical ownership. They even found an old photograph dated 1981 showing Ray Price standing beside the same fence line, the same one the HOA destroyed. That photo, authenticated by the local paper archive, became Exhibit 14B. Every piece of evidence stacked higher until even the defense attorney started sweating during hearings. The HOA's insurance company tried to intervene, urging a settlement, but Judith refused to sign anything that looked like surrender. Her stubbornness would become her undoing. The night before trial, Daniel sat on his porch listening to the distant hum of streetlights over the empty playground. The air was cold and clean. He thought of his father, of all the quiet evenings spent fixing the old fence, of the way Pop used to pat the posts and say, "These lines mean work, son. Not walls, just proof you built something honest." Daniel whispered, "I'll keep it honest, Pop." He glanced toward the dark silhouette of the slide and shook his head. Tomorrow, that plastic kingdom would stand as Exhibit A. The trial opened on a gray Tuesday morning in January. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. Reporters filled the back rows. Judith arrived in a tailored suit flanked by board members. Daniel wore the same worn jacket he'd used for every county permit meeting, not out of rebellion, but as a reminder of who he was. Martha began her opening statement with the calm authority of someone who knew the truth would do the heavy lifting. She laid out the timeline, the survey, the construction, the falsified plat, like a slow-burn thriller. Then she projected the aerial photos Daniel had taken, red flags marking the true boundary, the playground sitting squarely across it. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judith's lawyer tried to object, claiming the images were interpreted data, but the judge allowed them. Then came the kicker, the forged signature from the county filing. Martha had the handwriting expert ready, pointing out the mismatched loops and inconsistent pen pressure. When the expert concluded this signature was likely copied, not signed, Judith's expression faltered for the first time. Daniel took the stand next. His testimony wasn't flashy, just steady, heartfelt, detailed. He spoke about his father, about watching the bulldozers roll in, about standing quietly while the playground took shape. "I didn't want to ruin something for the kids," he said, "but I wasn't going to let my father's work disappear under concrete either." His voice cracked slightly at that last part, and even the bailiff's eyes softened. When Judith's lawyer cross-examined him, trying to paint him as a bitter recluse, Daniel stayed composed. "You like attention, don't you, Mr. Price?" the lawyer asked. "No," Daniel said evenly. "I like truth. Attention just came with it." That line made the local paper headline the next day. By the end of the second day, the jury had seen enough. The defense's witnesses contradicted each other. One claimed they had Daniel's permission. Another admitted there was never a signed consent. Martha's closing argument sealed it. "This case isn't about swings or slides," she said, pacing slowly. "It's about respect. For the law, for history, for the idea that ownership means something in this country. Mr. Price didn't ask for money or fame. He asked for what was his. The HOA built joy on stolen ground, and now it's time to rebuild justice on honest soil." The courtroom was silent when she sat down. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict. In favor of the plaintiff, Daniel Price. Damages awarded. Full restoration of property, removal of structures, and legal fees reimbursed. Daniel didn't cheer, didn't smirk. He just exhaled, slow and steady, the way a man does when a heavy weight finally leaves his shoulders. Judith slumped in her chair, staring at the table. The reporters rushed outside to broadcast the story. The next morning's headline read, "Man wins against HOA after they built playground on his land." The subheadline, "Court orders removal of entire structure." Within a week, The bright slides and picnic tables were dismantled piece by piece. Parents complained, but most quietly admitted the board had crossed a line. Daniel didn't show up to watch the demolition. He was done with the noise. Instead, he walked the boundary line once more, replacing fence posts with new cedar ones, each topped with a strip of reflective tape. When he reached the corner where the sandbox once sat, he planted a young sycamore tree. "For Pop," he said quietly. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying the smell of sawdust and new earth. For weeks after the verdict, Alder Creek Estates didn't sound the same. The cheerful clang of swings and children's laughter had vanished, replaced by the grinding of wrenches and the dull thud of posts being pulled from the ground. HOA maintenance crews moved through the fenced-off area like ghosts, dismantling what had once been Judith Kellerman's pride project. Reporters still came by, filming the slow removal of the bright red slide that had graced the local paper just a few months earlier. Daniel never went near the site while they worked, but each morning, he'd drive past on his way to the hardware store, the truck windows fogging as he watched his father's field slowly re-emerge from under the concrete. It looked barren and scarred now, a patchwork of dirt and broken mulch, but to him it looked alive again, free. He hadn't fought for scenery. He'd fought for principle. And now that principle was written into a court record that future HOAs across the county would study carefully before flexing too far. Judith, once the confident queen of Alder Creek, had gone silent. 2 board members resigned within days of the verdict. Another leaked internal emails showing that she'd pushed through the forged plat change, knowing it lacked county approval. Those messages went viral online, screenshots shared on homeowner forums and local news feeds with captions like, "The HOA that went too far." By the 3rd week, a recall petition circulated through the neighborhood. Homeowners who'd once whispered complaints about her suddenly found courage. The same people who defended her policies now apologized to Daniel in grocery store aisles, at the gas station, even at church. "We didn't know," they said. He'd just nod and reply, "Now you do. Keep it that way." Martha Vale became something of a local legend herself. A regional news outlet ran a Sunday feature titled "The Lawyer Who Took on the HOA Machine." She laughed when Daniel showed her the article. "Most of my clients just want the money," she said over coffee in his kitchen. "You wanted restoration." "That's rare," Daniel smiled faintly. "Pop always said land remembers who respected it." Martha raised her mug. "Then the land remembers you." He could tell she meant it, but beneath the vindication something heavier lingered. The lawsuit had consumed nearly a year of his life. His welding business had slowed because of all the hearings. Friends drifted off, not knowing what to say during the storm. Now that it was over, the quiet felt strange. On a gray Sunday morning, he walked the edge of his property, the new sycamore standing proud where the playground had been. The winter wind tugged at its young branches. He crouched and pressed his palm against the soil, feeling the faint pulse of warmth beneath. "We're back," he murmured. 2 weeks later, the county sent him an offer, an official request to convert the now vacant patch into a public green space under his supervision, funded by grants but privately owned. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same government that ignored the HOA's overreach now wanted his help to fix it. Still, he agreed with one condition, a small plaque at the entrance reading, "This land remains private, shared by grace, not by right." The county accepted. Volunteers from the community helped reseed the soil, this time with wildflowers instead of playground mulch. When the first blooms appeared, bright yellow and purple against the dark earth, even Daniel was surprised by how good it felt to hear laughter again. Kids chasing butterflies instead of swinging over someone else's boundary. Judith, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning. The county district attorney opened a formal inquiry into the forged survey documents. Her resignation letter hit the HOA website at midnight, a curt 3 sentences blaming administrative miscommunication. Within days, she moved out of Alder Creek. Her white SUV spotted heading west on Highway 9. No one knew where she went, and no one much cared. The new interim president, a quiet engineer named Robert Hayes, issued a public apology. "We lost sight of community," he said at the first open board meeting after the scandal. "We forgot that rules exist to protect, not to seize." He turned toward Daniel in the audience. "Thank you for reminding us." For the first time in months, the applause in that room was genuine. That night, Daniel drove home beneath a velvet sky stitched with stars. The road wound through pine shadows until it opened onto his land, the place that had started all of it. He parked by the fence, stepped out, and listened. No machines, no shouts, just the quiet song of crickets and the sigh of wind through the sycamore leaves. He thought about everything the fight had cost and everything it had restored. His name cleared, his land secured, his father's legacy safe. But more than that, he'd exposed a truth bigger than property lines. Every viewer who'd followed his story online, every homeowner tired of petty power, saw what patience and proof could do when anger alone wasn't enough. He hadn't just reclaimed acres. He'd reclaimed dignity. Months passed. The wildflowers spread. The new park, now simply called Pricefield, became a gentle symbol in the county. Families visited, leaving small thank you notes pinned to the fence. Thanks for standing up. Our HOA backed off after your case. Daniel kept them all in a tin box by his workbench. Sometimes he'd read them late at night, smiling at the thought that his fight had rippled far beyond Alder Creek. Martha visited once more in spring, pointing to the sycamore. They'll tell this story in law classes one day, she joked. Daniel chuckled. Let's hope they tell it right, that it wasn't about winning, just about keeping what's right. In late May, he hosted a small gathering. Neighbors, old friends, even a few kids who'd once played on the old swings. They roasted corn over a fire pit, shared pie, and told stories about the valley before the subdivisions. When dusk settled and the firelight danced across faces, Daniel stood and tapped his mug gently. I know it got ugly, he said, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Never let anyone convince you that paperwork outranks principle. Paper burns, land endures. The circle went quiet, then erupted in applause. Someone started humming an old folk tune, and soon laughter filled the field again, the kind that carried, not the kind that hurt. Later, as he packed up chairs under the stars, Daniel caught his reflection in the truck window. For the first time in years, he looked at peace. The sycamore swayed behind him, leaves whispering softly, and he thought he could almost hear his father's voice blending with the wind. Told you, son, the land remembers. He smiled, turned off the lantern, and walked back toward the house, his boots pressing firm into the soil that was once stolen, now steadfastly his again. And that's how Daniel Price turned the smallest field in Alder Creek into the loudest lesson in its history, a reminder that no matter how strong an HOA thinks it is, nothing grows right on stolen ground.